Hello, my name is James Vanatakis and I'm the Executive Director of the Australian American Fulbright Commission, and welcome to this edition of In Conversations. In September this year, we saw the American troops, allies and other Western powers such as Australia withdraw from Afghanistan. What followed were horrific scenes of people trying to flee, and we saw images of people at the airport clinging onto airplanes. They're images that will haunt us for years to come. Now, what lessons should we learn? What should we take away? And what is our responsibility as a nation that was there involved for 20 years? Now, to answer some of these questions, we are lucky enough to be joined by Beth Eggleston, who's a co-founder and director of the Humanitarian Advisory Group and a 2019 Fulbright Scholar. She's an amazing person and we're really lucky to have her joining us. So Beth, let's begin by telling us a little bit about your Fulbright Scholarship in 2019.
Yeah, great to be with you, James. Lovely to see you. Yes, so 2019 was the year that myself and my family were lucky enough to head over to the US. We feel incredibly lucky to have done that just before the pandemic kicked off. So I was working with the US Naval War College in Rhode Island, which was just fabulous. So they have a humanitarian response program there, and they do a lot of work around looking at how humanitarian agencies coordinate with militaries in the face of crisis, which is an area that I've worked with in the past. But it was just wonderful to see that from an academic and a military point of view. So it was a really interesting experience.
That's fascinating, because I suppose for the layperson, we don't think about the military thinking of humanitarian crises in this way, do we?
No, although people may have recently. If you live in Australia, you would have seen military being involved in the Black Summer fire response. You would have seen them involved with COVID. Where I am here in Victoria, you would have seen the Australian Defence Force supporting our police with checkpoints in and around Melbourne last year. So that's something that I think many people found quite confronting. And generally, when we think of the Australian Defence Force anyway being involved in disaster response, usually that's overseas. So they have, many capabilities that can enable operational humanitarian agencies to do their job really quickly. So often aid agencies will request for the ADF to, use their air assets and planes and things to move the humanitarian assistance into a rapid onset response, like an earthquake or a cyclone or something like that. And there's also, other kind of assets that the military have. So, we're increasingly seeing, as you would know, due to climate change, increasing frequency and scope of these kind of disasters. So actually, militaries are being involved more and more. And there's obviously a lot of politics and complexity that goes with that.
Yeah, I know that there was a lot of disquiet amongst Australians when they see the military operating, internally. But yeah, as you said, it's something that we're used to seeing, I suppose, the Australian Defence Force doing something over there, but seeing them internally is quite a shock. And how important is that public perception in working with the military?
I think it's very important. And again, it's perhaps not something Australians have been used to. But if you think of somewhere like Indonesia, though, their military is on the front line of disaster response. They're one of those kind of key kind of first responders, whereas in Australia, we sort of see the Australian Defence Force as, a last resort. So it's definitely something I think people were getting their heads around. And I know that there probably is some disquiet around, we have to ensure in Australia that is left as a last resort. And that's not to do anything about having some kind of crazy military state. It's around ensuring that our civilian capability, civilian agencies and everything have the funding, the structures and the processes that need to be able to, address these kind of issues. Actually, an article in The Guardian just came out today by Chris Barry, who used to be the head of the Australian Defence Force, just sort of saying, we don't have an Australian Defence Force just to pick up the pieces after disasters. Yes, they need to do that in extremis circumstances, but actually they're there for a different reason. And we need to ensure that we're addressing the challenges of climate change, so we don't have to use that, as many people call it, the big blunt instrument. There are many specialised agencies, Australian Red Cross and others, who work in that space, and it should only really be in the last resort that militaries are involved.
Maybe we can drift over to some of your work next. You are the co-founder of the Humanitarian Advisory Group. So it's an organisation built on the vision of structural change and changing power relations. Can you give us a little bit of background about the group and why you helped found it?
Yeah, so Humanitarian Advisory Group. So we are known very affectionately in the humanitarian sector as the HAGs, and we embrace that wholeheartedly. We set up HAG so almost 10 years ago now. And there were 4 of us who set it up, 4 women who had worked overseas in the international humanitarian system and had all come back to Australia. And I know, just speaking for myself, I guess I was feeling a little bit of frustration, I suppose, or maybe I should even just say impatience about working with a very large organizations. People often think, oh, these NGOs, they're nimble and, they're large, and often they're confederations. So someone like Oxfam, Oxfam Australia and Oxfam New Zealand and Oxfam Belgium, it's a huge lumbering beast. And I suppose we were really keen to ask some of the hard questions, and that meant, being independent. These organizations, they walk a very fine line. If you're operational in a country, you're actually delivering programs and undertaking humanitarian work, it sometimes can be quite hard for you to speak out on some of those sensitive issues because you are there, with permission of that government. So if you're going to be speaking out against them, can jeopardize your operations. So we decided, let's start something small, nimble, we can ask the hard questions. And really, Humanitarian Advisory Group is an organisation that supports those operational agencies. We undertake things like independent evaluations to ensure that there's impact and effectiveness of the programs that are being run. We provided advice, policy advice. We do a lot of training. And one of the key things we do is research. So trying to develop an evidence base that everyone from the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, operational NGOs, United Nations, even universities, they can take some of that evidence base, and it has a very much a practitioner focus. So it's not academic, it's an evidence base that practitioners can run with and say, oh, okay, I can see this is where things are headed. We can tailor our policies and hopefully, maybe even in real time, change some of what's happening in particular crisis organizations to ensure that there's more impact.
It's such an amazing organisation, and doing a bit of background before this discussion. What happens? I know a lot of aid workers who have worked in country and they come back very cynical and they walk away from it. You didn't. You came back, like you said, frustrated rather than cynical, and you decided to do something about it. And I mean, how hard is it to balance that line between that sort of idealistic or that optimistic world and the pragmatics of having to negotiate the various power structures and obviously working with governments and sometimes organisations you might not always agree with?
To be honest, I think being overly cynical is a luxury we don't really have. I mean, yes. There are times when we might sit around and tear our hair out about, this issue or that organisation, but really that's a luxury. To be idealistic, I mean, to me, that's it's thinking about what is the ideal, and that I think requires imagination and and thinking outside the box a bit. And I think it's a bit of a responsibility. I think it's too easy to say, look, it's all too hard. Everyone's in this for their own agenda. That might be the case, but we have to actually get in there and actually be propositional about how things can be done more differently. And I think it's also, for me, I get very quite passionate about people think about humanitarian assistance and think, oh, that's amazing, that's lovely. I mean, it must be a bunch of lovely, well-meaning volunteers. And I guess I'm quite passionate about also letting people know it's a highly professionalized, the kind of people that I've worked with. I mean, these are highly educated, multilingual, brilliant minds. These are not people who have just come in with a box of clothing. That ship has sailed. Good intentions are not enough. And letting people understand that this is a highly professionalized field, and that, I hope, can also take a bit of the sort of judgmental aspect to it. I mean, receiving humanitarian assistance is a right. And there is an obligation to provide it. It's not just a nice to have. So when people sort of say, oh, yeah, that's so lovely, to me, it's a service. There is a need, and there is that need needs to be filled if we see that there's a gap. And there's a responsibility for us to do it. It's not a it's not some kind of moral imperative. I just see it as being a responsibility.
So talking about our responsibilities, if we've all witnessed the events in Afghanistan, the fall of Kabul and the humanitarian crisis that was sort of there in front of us, but is continuing to unfold, even though it's fallen off the front page of the newspapers. What do you think is a responsibility, and how should Western countries such as Australia and the US, how should we be responding?
Very, very good question. I would say at the outset, just wanted to make it very clear, obviously, I'm not an Afghan, although I've been lucky enough and fortunate enough to work in Afghanistan. I don't speak for Afghans, and I want to make very clear that, it's not about me. I've seen a lot of people recently who have worked there. It sort of has become all about, this is how I've been helping Afghans respond. And I would say I've just been listening to a lot of Afghan journalists and people who have been working the previous Afghan government to find out what's going on there and the kind of assistance they would like to see. I mean, obviously there's the key piece, which there are a lot of people who would like to leave the country, and you would like to think that people that worked very closely with the US, Australia and their allies, they are very much at risk. And it's disheartening to me to see the low levels of numbers of Afghans who are being welcomed to Australia, despite for the last 20 years, sometimes not being able to see their family for years at a time because they have to be in safe houses and other areas. So I would very much like to see Western countries very much opening their doors to people who have risked their lives. I also think it's important that we try and navigate the sanctions piece, because I think it's easy to say, oh, we don't know how to engage with the Taliban. We don't know how to navigate this tricky and complex environment. And absolutely it is tricky and complex, but we need to learn from what's happened in other contexts where also there's difficult relations with governments and regimes in Myanmar or in our region, also in North Korea. How have we navigated and actually got humanitarian assistance and protection into those kind of countries? And I think ensuring that we can separate perhaps the government and regimes from the general population is really important. And maybe leveraging this concept of the Magnitsky laws and the idea of having sanctions on individuals rather than the whole state, so that you're not punishing, tens of millions of people in Afghanistan. There might be particular people that Western countries are not comfortable to deal with. So ensure that they don't have access to finance, to banks, elite schools, or whatever it might be. So I think we need to think outside the box a little bit. And I think we also need to make sure we just don't use it as an excuse, because just the fact that we may not have diplomatic relations with a particular, government doesn't mean that you throw the general population, you throw them out as well.
I mean, that's the really interesting thread, and I think that's the thing that a lot of people have been struggling with. Like when you look at something like Afghanistan and the Taliban, obviously there's that sense of not wanting to do with a regime that has that sort of history, but at the same time, it's not doing anyone any favors, is it? That they it's not helping the Afghani population if we just turn our backs on them, is it? Like it might make us feel good, either, philosophically, you might say, oh, well, I'm turning my back on them because they're a government I don't agree with. So, I mean, how do you think we can navigate that complexity of working with countries that might even be hostile to us?
Yeah, I mean, I actually think we do it all the time. I mean, look at our amazingly close relationship with the United States. We are fundamentally opposed to the fact that they still continue with the death penalty, or that they're the only country in the world who haven't ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Look at the United States' relationship with Saudi Arabia. I mean, there's fundamental differences between many different countries. And I think where there's political will, we navigate it. Where we feel like there's something in it for us, we do that. So I think we need to realise that we do have a responsibility for what has happened in Afghanistan. I think we also just need to, invest so much more in diplomacy. I feel like I do feel like Australia was late to the party on this. I mean, Australian government sent troops into Afghanistan. It wasn't until later they even opened an embassy. So the idea for me of not having an embassy when you're sending troops into harm's way, that's really problematic for me. And also they close their embassy more quickly than other allied countries. And I think that you've got that diplomacy piece, and then you've got the development program. Yes, Australia did send over quite a lot of money in terms of our aid program to Afghanistan over the last sort of 15 years, but now that's pretty much dried up. And I think there needs to really be a reassessment of where are we now? Yes, we don't have an embassy in country, but how are we going to navigate this? And it's not a question of if, it's a question of how. There must be a way in which we can try and work out with other different international donors where Afghanistan needs support, how we don't duplicate, how we're complementary. And also, I guess there's a big question of how do we negotiate or navigate the complexity of the Taliban have come out to say their main international partner now is China. So how did that happen? Why has that happened? What will be the future of that relationship? And what does that mean for other international players who are wanting to support Afghanistan? And I think it actually says something about the Taliban. If they are happy to stand up and partner with a country, they are, an Islamic regime. And if they are going to say that they're happy to work with China, who are locking up 1 million Uyghurs next door, I mean, I think that says something about them as well.
So up until this year, Fulbright programs had actually an exchange program in Afghanistan. I think there was something like 100 Afghanis got to be part of that exchange program. And I know that you personally were mentoring an Afghani through that process. So can you tell us a little bit about the work that you were doing there and how you've seen this program unfold?
Yes, so a friend in the humanitarian sector, they were running a program in Afghanistan, and she mentioned that there was one of her colleagues was applying for Fulbright, and she said, "Oh, I know that you've been on the Fulbright program. Do you have any, tips, or would you like to be in contact with him?" And I said, "Yeah, of course." So I was thrilled to be in touch with him. I'm not going to mention his name because I'm not sure if he's still in Afghanistan or not. And of course, when you talk to some of these young people, they just blow you away. His journey and what he'd had to sort of go through and the hoops he's jumped through and the levels that he's achieved at to get to this point is, absolutely mind-blowing, really. So we had our first conversation. We had a really great chat, really good chat for ages. He was working with the Afghan government and just learning about his vision. He wants to basically study in the US and learn about peace negotiation is the area that he wants to work in. Then I didn't hear from him from a period, and we got back in touch. And of course, he'd had COVID and was incredibly sick. Someone told me that the testing capability in Afghanistan is about 300 a day, a population of 38 million. So so many people that we know have been incredibly sick there. So at least he'd come through that. But just he's, again, you asked a question before about being cynical. I mean, he's someone that his whole life has been impacted, about political decisions that have been made, on other side of the world, really. As someone who had grown up in a refugee camp in Pakistan and had, come back to Afghanistan and risen through the ranks of the government, he really wants to be involved in shaping what the peace process looks like going forward. And so we had all these amazing conversations, and I was telling him about my interview and what it was like, the kind of questions that people asked me, and I, came up with a few questions that maybe he could prepare on. So we were having this, these great kind of chats and calls and emails. And then the Taliban took over, and I have not been able to hear from him since. So I'm very much hoping he either, he's safe in one shape or form. But I guess that's what gives me hope, though, about talking to people like this. And also, it's a lot of kudos to the program that they're attracting people like this, people with big ideas, with big dreams. And it's not, he had a very clear idea of how he would like to, what he would like to learn. And when I was saying to him, where would you like to study? He had about 5 different US universities and had really researched the different programs there and the different professors and who he wanted to learn from. And this professor, has worked in Colombia, and I would love to learn from, from her around, how the negotiations happened between the Colombian government and rebel groups there. And so he'd obviously just, he had such passion for what he wanted to do. So I really hope that is able to go forward, and that we see these Afghans being able to go to the US and make connections there. And something else that I'm finding quite heartening, and I have seen a little bit in the US, and I hope is going to be in other countries, whereas universities are having particular programs for sort of visiting scholars and others that they might be able to provide visas or other kind of support for people coming from Afghanistan to study in these institutions, so that we can, learn from their experience. And they are also safe for a period to take stock, and, let's hope that they are safe, going forward. But it is great to see. I've definitely seen a couple of universities in the US opening and promoting programs for people to come over to study.
But, you talk of Afghanistan in a real wonderful sense of hope, and, after 20 years of conflict, of this conflict, obviously it's been a country that's been racked with centuries of conflict, but after this conflict, the fall of Kabul, we witnessed horrifying scenes. I mean, what lessons do we take away, from, like it's easy to, if you go back, like you said, that the cynical perspective, it's easy for us to get around and say we should never get involved in another country overseas ever. But obviously we can't do that. I mean, we've the world has tried that. And I remember once reading this quote that said something like, the one worst thing than America not being involved in international affairs is, the one worst thing about America being involved in international affairs is America not being involved in international affairs. And I think that's a really important thing, an important perspective to take. But what lessons do we take away from this, from dealing with countries like Afghanistan, or, countries that have been rocked with conflict for so long?
I've thought about this a lot, and I suppose because it's 20 years since 9/11, and I was watching more footage about 9/11 this year. I've been sort of watching more documentaries about it. And what's interesting is, obviously we keep, in hindsight saying, could this have been handled in a different way? In some of the documentary footage I saw, which was people in New York, people on the streets, like people on the day reacting to the events. And there was a huge appetite, I guess, there, for revenge. I do wonder, could it have been done, differently? Would have a diplomatic or some kind of conference? I'm not sure if that was going to cut it for the sentiment of the American people at that time. Obviously there's different thoughts about how America then engaged, in Iraq, and there is, lots of different views on that, and the impact that misadventure had for Afghanistan as well. There is, many people feel like that the focus that shifted was very detrimental there. I mean, I agree with you that there's going to be a lot of lessons learned. There's been a lot of talk around the nation building piece, about people saying, oh, we're staying the course there to do nation building, but was that just a cover for more sort of counter-terrorism operations? And then others saying, well, no one can do nation building in another country. I mean, of course you can support in different ways, but if it's being led by another country, and I suppose, when people criticize the Afghan army, I'm not sure that I can concur with thoughts about saying the Afghanistan National Security Forces, that they were cowards and they ran off. They hadn't been paid for months and months and months. The numbers of people, yes, a lot of international troops killed in Afghanistan, absolutely, but tens of thousands of police and army, tens and tens of thousands of those have been killed. And I mean, I don't know, if I was a member of that, maybe I would have done the same thing. I just feel like the complexities there, and understanding that the shifting alliances and the shifting allegiances is something that we can't really comprehend in it. And I think we need to listen more about to what Afghan leaders are saying. There's interesting views coming out of Afghan diaspora, and then of course you have the Afghan government, past government, but then you've also got the civil society, obviously the women activists who are so incredibly brave, and their protests over the last 6 months on the streets of Kabul and in other places about girls' education is something I mean, you've never seen anything braver than that. And women are still being whipped in the street by Taliban, despite them saying, no, we're totally bunch of lefties now. We're really the soft, fluffy bunnies. And really, Sure, their PR may have taken it up a notch, but I don't believe that their other policies have changed at all.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? The we talk about the Afghan army, sort of collapsing, and I think if I think about an 8-month drawn out civil war, maybe that would have made us feel better, that we'd left them better prepared. But I'm not sure how much better it would be. I don't think it would have been it would have been an absolute disaster. It would have made things so much worse. So in a way, it wasn't great for the ego of the Western world, but it was probably better than the alternative of having this 8-month, 1 year drawn out civil war that would have seen.
Well, I mean, we have that, right? So we've just seen the ISIS attack on the funeral of one of the Taliban leaders' mothers that happened in the last couple of days. And, that's going to have, I understand that the Taliban have launched incursions on ISIS positions since then. So we could still just see history repeating itself again, that after a foreign power leaves, there is a vacuum, and then you have these other components that can, just wreak catastrophic impacts on the civilian population. But yeah, I think also we get, again, this sort of simplistic view of how people make decisions. I mean, being an Afghan, security forces member, or even being an Afghan farmer in the South who grows poppy. I mean, this idea of like, oh yeah, I'm going to grow poppy because I'm going to get lots of, get really rich. Then you hear about, oh, that farmer, his children were kidnapped and held ransom to ensure that he grew poppy for various, either a warlord or a government official or a Taliban commander, whatever that might be. I mean, if someone did that to me and took my children ransom, yeah, I'm going to make decisions maybe I'm not proud of later either. I just think we very much put the other onto the Afghan context. And sure, there's a lot that we don't understand, but I do feel like we should try a little bit of empathy there. We should try and understand why people do what they do, and what are the underlying reasons why people have to make some of these horrendous choices. I mean, people, wanting to leave the country. You're seeing the tears and the desperation. People don't want to leave their country. They've built a life, they've built careers, they've built dreams, and that's all being taken away. I have no idea how I would feel in those circumstances. I think of all the great opportunities I've been given, including a Fulbright scholarship, and imagine if all of that was sort of taken away and you had nowhere to work and nowhere to have your family in safety. I think we need to really inject some empathy into how we look at these kind of international relations.
Yeah. So Beth, just one final question. I mean, you mentioned the Hags, which you proudly refer to it, and you describe it as a team of courageous, principled, result-focused, and idealistic thinkers. And I think one of the fascinating things about your work is that you're proudly idealistic, but also want to achieve your idealism through pragmatic processes. And I think that's a really a balance that I think a lot of people could learn from. So what's next for the Hags? What do you see the Humanitarian Advisory Group doing next? I mean, how would you like to see the organisation reshape or continue to form?
It's a good time for you to ask me this question, because we're very excited just in the last couple of days actually to have signed a new research partnership with the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade for the next 3 years. And that's going to be looking at some really interesting pieces. So one is going to be looking at people and power and local leadership in humanitarian response. So some might say that the aid and development sector, suffers like many other sectors, but it's really having a reckoning at the moment in terms of looking at structural racism, looking at decolonisation, and a whole range of really very complex and difficult issues. And it's something that I think the sector is very aware of, but has not even known how to start addressing some of those pieces. We also want to look at how we green the humanitarian system. What does a net zero humanitarian response look like? Does it mean you can still use military with, large aircraft emitting lots of CO2? What does that look like? How do we use more local resources? How do we prepare better? And how do we ensure that we don't just throw out this idea of, no, we're saving lives, we can't give the environment a second thought? And also we'll be doing short turnaround pieces on ongoing humanitarian crises to hopefully see that we can make some real-time impact and shape the direction of some of those humanitarian crises. So yeah, we're very excited that that's happening, and we're having some new team members join us. And we'll keep doing our work for operational agencies and being responsive and hopefully agile. We're about 15 people now. We don't want to get a huge lot larger. We don't want to become one of the lumbering beasts. We want to make sure that we can still make decisions quickly and ensure that we're, you know, our research is focused where people on the ground think it needs to be.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for your time. It's been such a great pleasure talking to you. It's both inspiring and fills me full of hope. So I really appreciate the time. Good luck with your work, and I look forward to collaborating with you in the future.
Thanks, James. Great to see you. Bye.